Caleb Love is back in the transfer portal. And Missouri fans, I have it on good authority that Love was in Columbia this week. So you're going to want to hear all about this right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. Thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and now on the SiriusXM app as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. And we got to start with Caleb Love, don't we? Because I have it on really good authority that on Wednesday night, I do believe, Caleb Love was in Columbia with his father having dinner with Coach Dennis Gates. So, again, I'm just going to take you behind the curtain a little bit. For those of you who've listened to this show for a long time, you know this is mostly an opinion show. I'm not a guy out there trying to break a ton of news and act like I'm some insider, like a bunch of anonymous people on Twitter. So I'm not saying this lightly. This is coming from, granted, a secondhand source, but a secondhand source that I actually know, a guy I've played golf with before, and somebody that I don't think has any reason to lie whatsoever. So I take this with 99.99999% certainty that Caleb Love was indeed in Columbia, being wined and dined by Dennis Gates and company once again. So that's really interesting, isn't it? Because number one, who would have thought in a million years that Love would be back on the transfer portal market after committing to Michigan? I actually want to get into a little bit more of that in a minute from Michigan's side, but from Missouri's side, this is an interesting move because even though Love came back on the market, I wasn't initially thinking that Missouri would be all that interested. Obviously, the Tigers have been in the market for a big guy. We know they've came up a little bit short on a number of different guys. Certainly, Caden Shedrick was the guy that Dennis Gates used the most resources and capital on, trying to get on the roster. That didn't happen. He ended up at Texas. Jimmy Bell, kind of a backup plan. West Virginia transfer. Well, Missouri ends up with the silver medal there as well. He ends up at Mississippi State. But at this point, maybe Dennis Gates just feels like there really isn't another big guy worth pursuing, or at least not one who the Tigers can realistically get. So maybe Dennis Gates is just saying, well, I'll just take the talent. And again, the talent with Caleb Love is obvious, and I think the hope for Missouri and Dennis Gates is if Love came into the fold, well, he'd be off the ball more and not asked to carry as much of a load offensively as he was at North Carolina. So to me, with Missouri having enough lead ball handlers, I could definitely see that being the case, but I could also see a case where Love not maybe getting the number of shots or perhaps even minutes that he did at North Carolina. Maybe he isn't as happy as he might have expected. But at this point, you do almost have to think that Caleb Love needs a landing spot as much as Missouri needs talent. So maybe there is a good marriage here. And maybe if you're Dennis Gates, you're thinking, hey, we weren't very good at rebounding last year anyway. So we've already got a bunch of good ball handlers, a bunch of good shooters, at least on paper, for this 23-24 team. What if we just double down? Have another guy who, former 5-star, top 20 in the country type player. Obviously, the talent is there with Love. Maybe he just needs a little bit better coaching. Maybe Dennis Gates is just a better coach than Hubert Davis. That isn't the craziest notion I've ever heard in my life. So, again, while I was definitely a little bit hesitant when I heard that Love was back on the market, I didn't really think that Missouri would go after him. As you can see, I will certainly talk myself into it if Missouri does go there because, again, I don't even mind the idea of having as much guard talent and scoring just firepower as you possibly can. Because, again, if we're just, maybe Missouri can actually be better offensively next year. That's not an insane notion, because while the Tigers were one of the top 5, top 10 teams in the country in terms of offensive efficiency for most of the season, I think that tailed off a little bit toward the end of the year as sort of the limitations of the roster sort of started to present themselves. Let's put it that way. So if you have more depth, more talent, Missouri can actually play faster. They can get up more three-pointers, maybe almost be an even more extreme version of last year's squad. And like I was alluding to previously in the week, it's more about team rebounding, I think, with Missouri. They're never going to be a great rebounding team next year. It certainly doesn't appear with the roster they have now. But they can be better. They can at least block out. They can at least make more of an effort on the team's part. Now, again, I think Aiden Shaw showed a lot of effort and hustle last year. Who knows? With Shaw, with Noah Carter, with perhaps, the new guys, Jordan Butler is a taller player, certainly even Trent Pierce to a lesser extent. Maybe these guys can fight for the boards more than you think. But regardless, I think this is really interesting for Missouri, no doubt about it. Certainly a backup plan, or oddly enough, even though clearly I think Missouri would have taken Caleb Love the first time around. It's interesting that, circling back to Caleb Love once again. But, speaking of sources, I do have a guy who works at the University of Missouri I talk to all the time. Well, I'm just going to quote him really quickly on how this really makes Michigan look clownish, by the way. It's one thing to have higher academic standards. We can have all fans will debate, hey, well, this makes us look better, or no, we just want to take the best talent. That's a legitimate debate. To me, what's not debatable is this makes Michigan look ridiculous. You can't take the guy and announce it on your social media and all this stuff if he isn't officially in. And as my friend actually describes it here, my source, such a dereliction of duty is what he says, coming from someone who accepts and denies transfers. You don't have gray area unless you're doing it wrong, and especially with high stakes. I mean, I don't know how I can argue with that whatsoever. The Wolverines kind of humiliated Caleb Love a little bit for no reason whatsoever. So a weird move by them. One of the great programs, basketball and football-wise, in the country. That's a real bizarre move by them. Hopefully, maybe Missouri will gain from it. And coming up, this week I did get a little bit more of insight from Gabe DeArmond about how the name, image, and likeness process actually goes down. And you know what? I think this is good news for Missouri and all of college sports indeed. I'm happy to hear that it does go down this way. So let's talk about that and get into Mizzou football, Luther Burden, and all kinds of stuff as well. But first, I do want to tell you about Bird Dogs. And I tell you once again, my goal this summer, swim trunks, golf clothes, gym clothes. I'll add gym clothes to my two from last time. That's all I want to wear for the next few months. Who's going to help me do that? Bird Dogs, because with their great fitting, comfortable, versatile shorts, I can wear these babies literally just about anywhere. I can wear them in the pool. They dry off quickly. They have a liner. I can wear them to the country club. They look perfectly acceptable with a nice collared golf shirt. Nobody's going to have any idea that you were just swimming around an hour before. The comfy, stretchy fabric makes my calves shine, by the way. And I got to tell you, I've made many a young lady swoon with these calves back in the day. So I think you're going to enjoy it too. And I tell you, when you go to birddogs.com/LockedOnCollege, enter the promo code LockedOnCollege, they'll throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. Thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. And you everydayers may have noticed I made a mistake the other day when I was talking about John Bowl. I said he was Manute Bol's son and also the brother of Bol in the NBA. Well, it turns out both of those statements were incorrect. I don't know how I got that information in my head. Perhaps I just assumed the name Bol a guy in the NBA, Manute, obviously. Regardless, I was wrong. Somebody corrected me on Twitter. I Googled it, and guess what? They were right. So John Bowl, no relation to Bol nor Manute Bol. But here's what I do know. I like Dennis Gates. I like him a lot. And here was one thing I like to hear. I just want to give you a quote here from Gabe DeArmond over at Power Mizzou. It was about, Missouri finishing second to Matthew Cleveland and Jimmy Bell, of course. A lot of people, including myself, started wondering, does Missouri have a bit of a name, image, and likeness problem here? Is the funding there, for instance? Well, here's a bit more insight on that process that actually made me feel better about the whole thing. Gabe says, but if what I'm told is accurate, Cleveland and Jimmy Bell both got more money than Missouri was comfortable spending. And when I say Missouri, I mean Dennis Gates. Everything I've been told is that Gates made the call on what to spend, not the collective. That's how it works everywhere, no matter what people want to say. The head coaches are making these decisions. Schools aren't turning their recruiting over to the people running their NIL collectives. Well, that's good to know, and frankly, that's a question I've been asking for a few months now, so it's good to finally get an answer to that question. I've been asking myself, now wait a minute, who does decide who gets the money? Well, obviously it makes a lot of sense if ultimately it is the head coach, but I do have to say, once again, how is this not? It should be obvious that this is an example of why a de facto general manager type position is very necessary now in college sports. Not only do you have the transfer portal, constant player movement is potentially possible. Every single person, not only on your roster, could in theory transfer at any moment, but of course, that means any other player in the country can be available as well. So that means your talent evaluation is so much broader and has to be constant. There has to be at least one, if not multiple people in charge of this. But don't get me wrong, the fact that the head coach has the final call on this makes all the sense in the world. But I also think the idea that Eli Drinkwitz, for instance, can take on yet another role just simply because he gave up play calling duties and the offensive coordinator position, I just don't think that's realistic. So if they're not doing it already, I think Missouri and lots of programs are going to have to hire a whole staff of people specifically to just evaluate the rosters and the talent of the rest of the country. And on the Missouri football side of things, well, when it comes to the screen game, the wide receiver screen game, it's basically become a cliche at this point to say that that is an extension of the running game, right? But it is important to look at that, at least compare it to the running game, right? If that's what you're expecting, if that's your baseline of success, well, that's not the same as trying to throw the ball 10 to 15 or 20 yards down the field, is it? For instance, last season, I got an interesting stat here. Luther Burden, just by himself on wide receiver screens, hauled in 24 of his targets for 124 yards and 5 touchdowns. So 124 targets. He hauled in let me say that again. He hauled in all 24 of his targets. So he never dropped the ball. So that's essentially like a handoff, right? So if Missouri had a running back that had 24 carries for 124 yards and 5 touchdowns, you'd say that was a heck of a game, right? Well, that was Luther Burden's season in terms of the screen game. So if you truly look at that as an extension of the running game, well, guess what? It worked. It truly did, especially when you consider a lot of those touchdowns were around the goal line, and that obviously limits the amount of yards you're going to get. So for all the people who, including me at times, for sure, no doubt, I'm guilty of this as well, you get tired of Eli Drinkwitz throwing the ball horizontally. Well, certainly at times it worked, and it was effective. Now, does Missouri need to be more effective throwing the ball deep down the field, and in particular in the intermediate middle part of the field, in my opinion? Yes, absolutely. No question about that. Could the tight ends actually show a pulse this year in the passing game? That would be great too, but I do think we need to adjust our expectations a little bit and realize that, this isn't as though we're throwing the ball 24 yards. Excuse me, it's not as though we're throwing it 24 times down the field over and over again. Think of it as 24 handoffs, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, wow, 5 touchdowns and 124 yards? Yeah, we'll take that. And you know what? Speaking of Missouri football, Sam Horn, it was revealed Steve Bieser, the Missouri baseball coach, said that, Horn could have come back at the end of the season and pitched for Missouri here as they're continuing to make a push for the NCAA tournament, but Bieser shut him down, and frankly, good for him, because he was basically saying that I don't want to do anything to jeopardize this kid's shot at being the first-string quarterback, the starting quarterback for Missouri this fall. And you know what? For a guy who recently said the administration support under Desiree Reed-Francois has been 100% better for the baseball program so far, I'm really glad that he showed he's a team player with Missouri in general and the athletic department. And the more I think about it, really, I think I'm actually a Bieser guy. I really am, because Missouri has done about as well as you could possibly expect given the resources they've put into the program. And I think actually the relatively paltry resources that Missouri baseball's had to work with, I think they've, for the most part, used them pretty wisely and done some innovative things and have done some forward-looking stuff in terms of, heat mapping, or if that's the right term, just all types of advanced statistics and being able to, track everything that these guys do. You notice that the Tiger players have the sort of Peyton Manning wristband on the belt of their pants at times. They're looking down at it all the time. Obviously, that's something that is very unique and new to baseball. So I'm sure some of that stuff has been more effective than others, but I've heard lots of people throughout the baseball landscape being impressed by what Missouri has done in terms of their forward-looking stuff. So I know that's kind of vague, but I just want to say, just generally speaking, I got to say, I think I'm on board with Bieser at this point. And if he gets a new baseball stadium, I really think Missouri could make that a more of a must-see type of event, at least more so than it is right now. I think the big key is you got to draw the locals, you got to draw the students, because, obviously people aren't going to be coming from St. Louis and Kansas City to see college baseball. It's just not the same type of event here that is for football, and to a somewhat lesser extent, men's basketball. But baseball, a 2,000 seat, nice, comfortable, easy to get to, fun for the family type of space where every single seat in there feels like you're on top of the action. I'm basically describing the new softball experience over off Stadium Boulevard. If they can just kind of recreate that with baseball, I really do think the program can take some pretty serious strides. And it's not as though you don't have a good product there. SEC baseball is fun to watch, no doubt about that. And coming up, the conventional wisdom is that former James Madison defensive end who entered the transfer portal, Isaac Ukwu, it's been assumed that it's down to Missouri and Ole Miss, but I have a little bit different information from one of my colleagues at the Locked On Podcast Network. And plus, I want to talk a little bit about last night's game from Michael Porter Jr. and the Denver Nuggets right after this. Folks, I think I may have messed up for the second time this week in terms of just ordering this show, because I really should have brought up Isaac Ukwu earlier than the last segment of the show, because the James Madison defensive end has had 15 and a half sacks the past 2 seasons. And just so we're clear here, James Madison is a Division I program. They haven't been for the entirety of my life or anything like that. They're a relatively new entrant into the football bowl subdivision, I suppose I should say, to use the vernacular of our times. But that guy's pretty good, apparently. 15 and a half sacks is no joke at James Madison, because James Madison was no joke whatsoever last season either. In fact, if you look at Football Outsiders, their FEI rankings, James Madison, the 52nd best team in the country. Missouri 37th last year, for instance, and Auburn 38th, just according to their ranking. So obviously, FEI, for instance, liked Missouri quite a bit better than their 6-7 record would have shown you, number one. But more importantly, it just gives you an idea of just how good James Madison really was last season with their 8-3 record. So those sacks are not a joke. That's against real competition. It's not just against, underclass FCS type competition. So that's going to be an interesting name to watch. And as I said previously, the conventional wisdom has been it's either going to be Ole Miss or Missouri. Coach Prime in Colorado has been kicking the tires on that young man as well, reportedly. But from what I've heard from Zach Blackerby over at Locked On Auburn, I think Auburn has a real shot as well. And Zach thinks it's going to be either Missouri or Auburn. So if it ends up being Ole Miss, I guess I'll be a little bit surprised at this point. But certainly Missouri could use another edge rusher, and I think at this point in the process, it'd be hard to imagine getting one a whole lot better than Isaac Ukwu. And moving to pro basketball here, just a little bit to close out the show. Michael Porter Jr., of course, the former Tiger, the really good game last night. I thought hitting, not only was he 4 of 7 from the three-point line, if you actually go watch that game, I mean, he's hitting tough shots. Those are not easy shots that Michael Porter is hitting whatsoever. He's going and moving and finding those shots. Truly one of the best shooters in the NBA right now is what Michael Porter has become. And I think some people still are hung up on Michael Porter's back injury in terms of, what could have been, that type of deal. And that's certainly one way of looking at it. It certainly is a what-if type deal because I think he's a multi-time all-star if his back is just normal and he never had any back problems whatsoever. But another way to look at it is this is an incredible success story because it's actually incredible what he's doing the more you actually look into what his back injury really was and continues to be. So I give him a ton of credit for not resting on the laurels of that massive $100 million, almost $200 million extension that he signed with Denver over a year ago now, I believe. No, he's still working hard and working on his game, working on his body, and actually improving. And again, to my point about how it's amazing what he does, despite the fact that, again, Porter Jr., in my opinion, one of the best shooters in the league right now, certainly one of the most unique shooters in the league right now at 6'10". Well, despite all of that, Porter Jr. only played 31 minutes last night. And I say only because typically in the Western Conference Finals, man, you are putting everything out on the line, playing every minute you possibly can. And, for LeBron James at 40 years old, for them to put him in at 40 minutes last night up in the altitude of Denver, the Lakers were desperate to try to get that win, and they should be. They should be desperate to try to get every single possible win that they can at this point. So if you're Denver, from their perspective, I'm sure they'd love, in theory, to play Michael Porter Jr. more than 31 minutes a game because he really is that good. The problem is, I just don't think his body can hold up from playing that kind of load, more than that type of load, over and over again, especially in the playoffs. They're going to need him all the way through the rest of this run if they're going to hoist the Larry O'Brien trophy. But you know what? Thanks as always for listening to Locked On Mizzou, of course. You everydayers, love you so much, and we're obviously going to have a ton more on Missouri basketball and football. I've teased my rising interest rates and my financial knowledge, putting that to use. Actually, I think I have some guesses that are pretty insightful in terms of future conference realignment. I promise we'll get to that next week right here on Locked On Mizzou.